Jerry's great presentation is in effect about, in part about socioeconomic inequality and health inequality. And so when the programme was being drawn up, it was suggested that it might be really interesting to present some work that we are doing around a component of socioeconomic inequality, earnings and income inequalities. Whether it is really interesting, I'll let you be the judge. So if you're still awake in 20 minutes, you can tell me if you enjoyed it or not. Jerry mentioned caveats there. I think it's quite important to get caveats out of the way. So the first one I'll mention is that I'm going to present a whole series of economic statistics, and the caveats are as follows. I'm not an economist and I'm not a statistician. So frankly, you'd be as well asking a random passing member of the public to present some of these data. In my defence, I have presented and discussed these data with a whole number of bona fide economists who reassure me the analyses are sensible. Whether they're particularly thrilling or not, I suppose, is another matter. The other caveat is that the work we've done has looked at household income as well as earnings, but because I'm kind of short of time, I'm just going to focus on earnings data today, and there's a number of caveats associated with earnings data that I'll pick up at the end. I suppose that begs the question, why look at earnings data? But clearly earnings are a major component of income. There are clear links between income and health, income inequalities and health inequalities, as Jerry has mentioned. So if we want to narrow health inequalities in this country, we need to narrow income and broader socioeconomic inequalities. And to do that, I think you need to understand the nature of these, some of these socioeconomic inequalities. And earnings data allow quite in-depth, detailed analysis of that. What data allow you to do that? Well, there's a study from the ONS called the Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings. It's not a survey in terms of questionnaires and falling response rates. It's actually a 1% sample of all employee jobs in the UK, taken from the HMRC pay-as-you-earn records. So it excludes the self-employed, and I suppose it excludes those who don't pay tax as well, like, I don't know, Rangers footballers or something like that. That's a joke. Please don't tweet that, because there's lunatics out there. Thank you very much. The data is large, so it allows you to look at data for the 4 UK nations, and we also looked at data for the 11 largest cities across England and Scotland that you can see on your screen there. What we were looking at changes in inequalities in earnings for all full-time and part-time employment over time, how that varied by occupation type, but I'm not going to have time to talk about that today, how it varies in the public and the private employment sectors, a particular focus on low pay, and then also gender inequalities in all of the above. That's quite a lot, and when you multiply it by 4 countries and 11 cities, it becomes really quite a lot. So what I'm going to do is just pick out a couple of points from these 4 highlighted subtopics, just to give you a flavour of what some of the analysis showed. In doing so, there'll be a lot of data. If you think Jerry's graphs were messy, you've seen nothing yet, and I'll have to run through it pretty quickly, so I apologise in advance. Before I do that, there's some dull stuff just to mention. We were looking at gross weekly pay, because that's the kind of headline indicator that the study uses, and all the earnings that I show you are adjusted for inflation. So if you see an earning, a weekly earning in 1997, it is in today's prices or 2016 prices. And we were analysing data, mainly looking at percentiles of the distribution and quite crude measures of inequality. If you're not statistically minded, and I can tell most of you are not statisticians because you look quite normal, and you're worried by measures of things like percentiles of the distribution, I've also got a kind of bluffer's guide to statistics here in the same way Jerry had. So what we've got is a 1% sample of weekly earnings across the UK, which might look a bit like that, with low and high and medium earnings. What we do is we sort them from the very low paid to the kind of filthy rich in society. I don't know, film stars and consultants in public health, these kind of people. And then we break that distribution into hundredths, if you can see that, called percentiles. And so therefore the middle of that distribution is the 50th percentile, and that is also the median, and I'll be reporting on median income. Don't confuse median with mean, because that gets the statisticians kind of gnawing their anoraks and frustration. It's a different kind of measure. And we can compare it with other points in the distribution, like the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile. These aren't the bottom 10% or the top 10%. They're just points in the distribution. And then we can look as kind of markers of low and high earnings. And then in terms of inequalities, we can look very simply at the difference between the two and how many times higher one is from the other. Does that make some kind of sense? Because that's the kind of basis of what I'm going to talk about. So there's quite a lot to show you. I'm going to run through it very quickly, so let's do this. The first chart I'll show you is looking at trends in weekly income for all jobs in Scotland over a 20-year period. And the point to note is that the lowest, this is the 10th percentile, haven't seen their earnings increase that much over time. Whereas if you look at the higher earnings, the 90th percentile, then they clearly have, until you get to the recession. And the recession has a big impact in reducing levels of earnings. And that overall pattern is seen across the whole distribution, but at a greater level among the higher earnings. But note also the gap between the top earnings and the rest of the distribution. So in absolute terms then, the gap increases over time, but it peaks really just before the effects of the recession kick in. And in a relative sense, the higher earnings had wages of about 6 times those of the lower earnings. That increased to about 7 times, but then came back again because of the effects of the recession. And this is just a different way of showing the same trend in a relative inequality and a crude measure of absolute inequality. Now that was all jobs altogether, but obviously you get differences when you look at full-time and part-time employment. But for full-time employment, it's basically exactly the same picture, but because the distribution of earnings are narrower, because we're not including the very low-paid part-time jobs, then obviously inequalities are lower. But it's the same overall pattern of widening absolute inequalities and fairly flat relative inequalities. For part-time employment, it's a bit different with a much lower absolute difference but a higher relative gap. Now at this point it gets a little bit confusing, so I think it's important just to take out the main points of what these analyses show, which are that there's an impact of the recession on earnings and on previously widening inequalities. But the main point is that over 20 years there's been no real reduction in inequalities, and for some aspects of inequalities they have widened, and that's the point I'll come back to at the end of the talk. So the second of the 4 things was to look at how these things differed in the public and the private sector, and within this there are 3 points I want to make fairly quickly. The first is just about the size of the public employment sector in Scotland. So public sector jobs account for a huge proportion of all employee jobs in Scotland. So here we have our 4 countries and our 11 cities, and in Scotland about a third of all employee jobs are in the public sector. That's much, much higher than England, and in places like Dundee it's about 40% odd. If you look at female jobs, then the figures jump up to about 40% of all female jobs are in the public sector, about 1 in 2 in Dundee, and again these figures are much higher than in England. And the point of that is that with such high numbers, then theoretically there's a real potential for narrowing income inequalities in Scotland, and probably more so than in England. The second point to note is about that effect of the recession, because it's been much greater on the private sector employment. And that's important because the private sector is much more associated with insecure employment in terms of sort of 0 hours contracts, lack of pension security, all these kind of things. And if you look at the trends in weekly earnings for the private sector over that period, and we highlight the recession, you see that earnings haven't really, well, there was a big impact of the recession, then they haven't recovered to pre-recession levels. Whereas in the public sector, although there was also an effect, it was less so. There was a stagnation there in terms of a wages freeze, but not the same effect that was experienced in the private sector. And if we just put that graph up to one corner of the screen, that's Scotland, we can see that elsewhere in the UK there were similar effects about a greater impact of the recession in the private sector in terms of the impact of earnings. It's a very similar trend for full-time jobs and for part-time jobs. The gap between the 2 sectors is a bit wider, and I'm not going to have time to show that today. The third and final thing in this section is to look at how earnings have changed over time across the whole distribution between the 2 sectors. So this is showing the percentage increase in earnings over 20 years in the private sector, depending how much people earn. So the greater the people are earning, the higher the increase has been in that private sector. Therefore, you would think widening inequalities. The interesting thing, I think, is in the public sector, the opposite is the case, and there's been a big increase actually among the lowest paid in the public sector in Scotland. And obviously increases in things like the UK minimum wage, also issues around living wage has obviously played a part in that. These increases are driven particularly by big increases in the lowest paid part-time workers, but it's also broadly true of full-time jobs too. It's a different pattern, but looking at the lowest earners, the bigger increases have been in the public sector rather than the private sector. And also quite interestingly, these increases have been bigger in Scotland than in England, so slightly different things going on here. So, again, before this becomes too confusing, just summarising a few key points from that. The scale of the public sector workforce, I think, does often offer genuine opportunities. The private sector has been much more affected by the recession, with, in part, consequence, a widening gap between the two sectors. Bigger increases amongst the poorest paid in the public sector, and particularly in Scotland, and so some narrowing of inequalities in that sector. Are we all still awake? The third of the four things to look at, and I won't spend much time on this, is around low pay. And I've just picked one indicator, which is the percentage of people earning below the real living wage. So in 2016, for which is the last year we got data, this was set at £8.25 an hour by the Living Wage Foundation for outside London. It's a bit higher in London. And the real headline figure is that in 2016, about 500,000 jobs were paid below the level of a living wage. So that's about 1 in 5 of all jobs, 40% of part-time jobs, although it varies considerably across the country. So we actually had these data by parliamentary constituency for some reason, and if you look at the data, that's the 20% of all jobs being below the living wage across Scotland, but it varies considerably. And looking at part-time jobs, the numbers basically double. And in parts of Glasgow East, you've got about 2/3 of all part-time jobs are paid below a living wage. And the whole issues about the rise of in-work poverty and all these things are obviously relevant to these data. So the scale of that, I think, is quite alarming, but actually it's not as bad as it is elsewhere in the UK. So comparing the countries, Scotland's figure is actually much lower than elsewhere in the UK, and it's actually some of the English cities in red where the figures are highest, particularly when you look at part-time jobs. So again, in summarising that then, the scale of low pay, I think, is considerable and alarming, but actually it's not quite as bad as elsewhere in the UK. I've not showed you data for 2017, but they show a very slight improvement across the UK, but actually a slightly bigger improvement in Scotland, in particular parts of Scotland like Glasgow and Dundee. Okay, the last of the four things I want to talk about is gender inequalities in all these aspects. So there's 5 sort of quick points I want to make. We're going to overlook the fact that a man is describing gender inequalities at this conference because it's just a little bit awkward. But looking first at male and female median weekly earnings in 2016. And for comparability, I'm just using full-time employment here. Obviously, the vast majority of part-time jobs are held by women, and that kind of skews the comparisons. But actually, that's quite a contentious point, so I'm going to come back to it just in a second. But for now, looking at full-time employment, the bottom line is wherever you look, in terms of full-time weekly earnings, men earn more than women. And if you quantify that gap in sort of percentage terms, then you can show, for example, in Scotland, that male weekly earnings are about 18% higher than female weekly earnings. However, the good news is that if you went back 20 years ago, the figures were much, much higher. So the gender gap has come down considerably, and it's come down everywhere. The second thing to say is that, as you know, the gender gap is higher at higher levels of pay. So this is showing how much more male earnings are. So there's the 18% for Scotland. And the greater the level of earnings, the greater the gender gap. But again, it's come down considerably. If we put that again up to one corner, we can show how that compares with elsewhere in the UK. And in England especially, you see this very clear gradient. The greater the earnings, the greater the gender gap. If we look at some of the cities, you see that's very apparent in places like Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and obviously also London. So the third thing, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing, or possibly more confusing, depending on how it's going, is that the size of the gender gap depends quite a lot on how you measure it. So I've shown you weekly earnings. The official measure for the gender gap does not use weekly earnings. It uses hourly earnings, and that's because women, on average, work fewer hours in a week, so they say it's not a valid comparison. They also only look at full-time, and they also calculate it in a particular way that I'm not going to get into today. But actually, a large component, or a significant component of gender inequality is the fact that women have disproportionate levels of caring responsibilities for families, children and the rest, which impacts on the numbers of hours they can work. For some women it might be a choice, for a lot, particularly in low pay, it's not a choice. So how you define gender inequality, I think, influences what choice of measure you use, and that has a major impact on the size of the gap. So if you're looking at, first of all, just full-time employment, I've shown that weekly earnings are about 18% higher for men. If you use instead this hourly definition, it more than halves the level of gender inequality, and in Northern Ireland suggests that there isn't any gender inequality. Is that true? If you use their particular way of calculating it in the official measure, it also reduces it a little bit more, which I won't get into. But if you accept this broader measure of gender inequality and the impact it has on how many hours you can work, then if you look at all jobs, then weekly earnings are about 50% higher for men than women. And even looking at that on an hourly basis, it's still about 20% higher earnings for men compared to women. And even if you adjust it again in the way that they do for the official measures, it's still very, very high. So depending on how you define gender inequality, influences how you measure it and what it actually shows. The last two things I'll do, I'm sticking with full-time employment and weekly earnings just for the sake of speed and comparability, but bear that last point in mind. And this is just about the gender gap in the public and the private sector, and the main headline to note is that the gender gap has reduced in both public and private sectors, but remains much, much larger in the private sector. So that's the Scottish private sector, the gender gap between median earnings, the public sector, it's come down in both. That decrease in the public sector in Scotland has been much more noticeable than in England, where for the last 15 years or so it hasn't really decreased. So the gender gap in the public sector is much narrower here than it is south of the border. And that greater gender gap in the private sector you see at all levels of pay, and that lower gap in the public sector in Scotland you also see at all levels of pay. So if that makes sense, you can look at these data to show that in 2016, higher gender gap in the private sector, but it's come down in both over 20 years. Whereas in England, marginally higher gender gap in the private sector, and it's not really come down in the public sector. And so the public sector gap in Scotland is much lower than in England. And the final thing I'll show you is that although we talk about gender inequality in terms of the biggest gap being among the higher earners, actually, another feature of it is that the lowest paid jobs are predominantly held by women. So, for example, around 2/3 of all jobs which are paid below the minimum wage are held by women. Around 2/3 of all jobs paid below the real living wage are also held by women. And even if you don't even look at part-time employment, but you look at full-time employment, then much higher numbers of jobs are held by women in low-paid full-time jobs too. So, in summarising all that then, the size of the gender gap depends how you measure it. If you use weekly data, it's very, very high, but it's come down a lot over the past 20 years everywhere. There's a lower gap in the public sector than the private sector, with a bigger reduction in Scotland than in England. The biggest gap is still among the higher earners, but as I've said, the lowest paid jobs are still predominantly held by women. Whew. So that's it over. I've mentioned some caveats. I'll just pick out a few of them. These are earnings data, so they exclude people who don't have earnings. They exclude the elderly, the unemployed, too sick to work. So they very notably underestimate the scale of true inequalities. There are also individual measures, so they don't really tell us about how many people are dependent on those earnings. Is it one person in a household? Is it 5 people in a household? However, it's a very large data set which isn't associated with the problems of some surveys in terms of inaccurately reported income measures, falling response rates and all the rest. And although I don't have time to show you, we have done a bit of analysis looking at overall net household income from the Scottish Household Survey, and actually the broad trends and patterns that I've showed you are very, very similar in terms of the impact of the recession, in terms of widening absolute inequalities and very flat relative inequalities. So what does it all mean? I think there are reasons for optimism in terms of the reduction in gender inequality, the size of the public sector in Scotland, and some evidence that inequalities have narrowed there, possibly linked to issues around living wage campaigns and the rest. Reasons for pessimism, well, the much more vulnerable private sector, the fact that the IFS is forecasting a widening of income inequalities linked to austerity measures, which Martin's going to talk about in a second. The predictions around child poverty as part of that are frankly terrifying, and because of the link between income and health, we would expect to see health inequalities widen further too. And the last thing I'll say before I finally finish is, I think the other reason for pessimism is the scale of what's required. So if we look at income inequality that Jerry was showing us, there are different measures in Scotland, but it's round about this level, which is lower than the British level because of the impact of the southeast of England. But it's really about understanding what's happened in the last few decades. in that Britain has changed quite dramatically in terms of its high levels of inequality. So to address this, it's not really about tinkering with maybe minimum wage things, it's about a much more radical, bigger change which is required. At that point I'll stop. If you're absolutely off your head and you want any more details of these tedious statistics, please feel free to drop me an email. And sorry to people I insulted during the presentation. I was just trying to liven up an otherwise tedious set of slides. Thank you very much.